Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining today's webinar on food, land, and water resilience. I'm Chris Field, director of the Stanford Woods Institute for the Environment. Today's webinar is part of the Resilience Roadmap, a nonpartisan effort led by the Nicholas Institute for Energy, Environment, and Sustainability at Duke University. Partners in the roadmap are hosting a series of webinars on the National Climate Resilience Framework from ideas to action as part of the stage setting for the National Adaptation Forum in mid-May. Before addressing the main topic, I'm going to start with acknowledging the indigenous people on whose ancestral land those of us at Stanford sit today. Stanford sits on the ancestral land of the Muwekma Ohlone tribe. This land was and continues to be of great importance to the Ohlone people. Consistent with our values of community and inclusion, we have a responsibility to acknowledge, honor, and make visible the university's relationship to Native peoples. The Stanford Woods Institute for the Environment, which is this year celebrating 20 years of sustainability leadership, is Stanford's cross-campus hub for advancing understanding and developing practical, just solutions to our era's pressing environmental problems. Woods scholars team with other researchers, governments, companies, and NGOs to build bridges from research to action to address challenges in climate, health, food, water, oceans, and biodiversity. We're excited to be a founding pillar in the bold new Stanford Doerr School of Sustainability, which is turning 2, just as the Woods Institute turns 20. Released in September 2023, the U.S. government's first ever National Climate Resilience Framework establishes a vision for a climate resilient nation and guidance for resilience-related activities and investments by the federal government and its partners. The framework establishes 6 objectives, but much still needs to be done to identify priorities within each and determine how to coordinate implementation from the federal government all the way down to local communities. Today, we'll focus on the implementation of the framework's Objective 5 to sustainably manage lands and waters to enhance resilience while providing other benefits. For today's webinar, I'm thrilled to be joined by Ertharin Cousin, Dylan McDowell, and Khalid Osmond. Ertharin Cousin was the 12th executive director of the UN World Food Program from 2012 to 2017. Following that, Ertharin became the Payne Distinguished Professor at Stanford's Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies, as well as Distinguished Fellow at the Woods Institute Center on Food Security and the Environment. From 2009 to 2012, Ertharin served in the Obama administration as the U.S. Ambassador to the UN Agencies for Food and Agriculture and Chief of the UN Mission to the UN agencies in Rome. Ertharin is founder and CEO of Food Systems for the Future, an organization that catalyzes, enables, and scales innovative, market-driven agri-food system businesses capable of improving nutrition outcomes in underserved and low-income communities and delivering financial return across the value chain. Dylan McDowell is Executive Director of the National Caucus of Environmental Legislators, an organization with the mission to empower a nonpartisan network of legislative champions to protect, conserve, and improve the natural and human environment. Originally trained as a science communicator, Dylan's developed education and communication materials for the Smithsonian Environmental Research Center, the Hatfield Marine Science Center, and Oregon Sea Grant. Based in Salem, Oregon, Dylan is chair of the city's Parks and Recreation Advisory Board and, my personal favorite, co-founder of Salem Bike Vision, an initiative to increase safe and protected infrastructure throughout the community. Khalid Osman is assistant professor of civil and environmental engineering at Stanford, a position he's held since 2022. His research uses quantitative and qualitative methods to assess public perceptions of water infrastructure, water conservation efforts, and the management of infrastructure to meet the needs of those being served by the systems. He's focused on building equity in water sector infrastructure, water affordability, and stakeholder community engagement in sustainable civil infrastructure systems for achieving environmental justice. The format for today's conversation is that I'll kick things off with a few questions. At about 20 minutes before the hour, I'll turn the figurative microphone to you and pose questions from all of you in the audience. To get a question into the queue, please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Apologies in advance if we don't have time to get all of your questions. Let me turn first to Ertharin. We hear a lot about the potential for better management of food waste to solve our food security problems, both in the US and around the world. Doing a better job of waste strikes me as easy at some extent, but also a really big lift if we're going to comprehensively make reductions. How do you see better management of waste fitting into food for the future?
Well, Chris, first of all, thank you for including me in today's conversation. Appreciate it very much. I always look forward to my engagements here at Stanford University.
And we look forward
And
to having you.
thank you. And here's the reality. We know that 40% of all the food that is harvested on an annual basis is wasted. In the global north, that waste takes the form of retail and household waste. And in the global south, it takes a form in food loss from the farm gate to the consumer because of lack of access to adequate transport, storage, warehousing. And the result is not just that we are losing food that could support access to better food security and nutrition, but that the evidence suggests that if you accumulate all of the food waste that is wasted globally, and stored in landfills, that the greenhouse gas emissions would total make it the third largest country behind the US and China in greenhouse gas emissions. So it's critical that we address reduce the food loss and waste, and the opportunity for us to address the food security and nutrition, as well as addressing the greenhouse gas reduction is quite clear. So you ask, is it possible? Of course it's possible. The challenge is, are we willing to invest the capital that is necessary to support the changes that are required to upscale, to not only reduce food loss and waste, but to upscale food loss into some other assets that could potentially support the food system, and as a result, reduce greenhouse gas emissions.
And when you think about reducing food waste, especially in the US, is the agenda primarily one of making sure that less food gets into the waste stream, or doing a better job of the food that does get into the waste stream and making sure that it's used for composting or other kinds of products?
Well, the first answer is of course the one that you want to work to achieve, and that is that we reduce the amount of food, if not eliminating the amount of food that gets into the waste system. But we live in reality, and recognizing that there is food that, because of consumer demand and because of we don't like ugly food, we don't like ugly produce, we don't we when fruits and vegetables are bruised, we toss them, whether it's at the retail level or at the household level. And so the opportunity to instead capture that food, to support the food security, is quite obvious and available. A good example of this is Matriarch Foods, one of the partners that we're working with, that is rescuing food from the fields that would otherwise have been rejected by pickers as not acceptable for the marketplace. And that food is now being used to create a emergency food product that is a soup that is then processed and distributed through the food banks to support access to a ready-to-eat vegetable soup that has been widely accepted by consumers. And scaling that up has the promise for, again, as I said, addressing that reduction in food waste while also addressing the issues of food security and malnutrition. The one point that I think is really important here is in the food system, when we talk about GHG reduction or emission, we don't have the luxury as you do in the energy or transportation system of making that the priority. Anything we do in the food system to support reduction of greenhouse gases, we must also ensure that we are prioritizing access to affordable and nutritious food. We can't make it harder for the 3.1 billion people who can't afford access to a diverse diet today to meet their food and nutrition needs by working to address greenhouse gas emissions. We must simultaneously prioritize both of those issues in developing the solutions that are good for the planet, but also good for the people.
And Dylan, are you seeing action on food waste in state legislators around the country?
Absolutely. I really appreciate that overview. And I think to just take 30 seconds, one thing I like to always share is just a little context about the difference of state legislatures, because I think that depending on which state you're coming from, it can look really different. So in states like California, it's one of fewer than 10 states that's considered roughly full-time. So they're paid relatively well. They have staff. They meet most of the year, or at least a majority out of the year. And that's actually the rarity across the country. If you look at states like Nevada, they meet every other year. If you look at states like Rhode Island and New Hampshire, they don't even have an office to go to unless you're in leadership. In many cases, you get paid very little. States like New Mexico don't actually pay their legislatures, let alone most of them don't have staff. And so our organization, we like to say we play a remote environmental staff role for lawmakers who often are under-resourced, under capacity, to help them really understand solutions of how they can bring some of these topics forward and make sustainable policies across the country. One thing I think that's really important with that is how do you, if you're a legislator with limited time, limited resources, there's limited state budgets, kind of bring these topics together. And I think that's where food waste is really starting to become a bigger part of the climate conversation right now. I think for many folks, I'm sure Catherine, you're someone who's been at the forefront of this for a long time. There's been people pushing on that, but we're seeing more and more states include that in their climate action plans, really trying to put in mandates for tracking methane in particular, thinking about the challenge of the greenhouse gas that methane produces alone. And then in places like California, there was a bill in 2016 to not only have the methane reductions, but also to reduce organic waste disposal and to redirect food that was going to be surplus to people in need rather than landfills. And so once again, I think there's not only the food conversation, but how do we bring this into the climate conversation where there's a lot of time, money, investment happening right now, and make sure that's all part of the same conversation, which I think is then very intersectional, as Catherine was saying, to thinking about people that need that food for health and all these other social issues that we want to make sure we're prioritizing at the same time.
Khalid, there's a really strong environmental justice dimension to decreasing food waste. There's also a strong environmental justice dimension to providing the water to grow the food at the other end. You see the water demands of agriculture sort of lining up with the food waste issue, especially in the context of environmental justice.
Chris, like Adrian said, thanks for having us in this conversation. And just to keep the flow of the conversation going, one of the challenges that we have with agriculture, specifically thinking about the California context, and I know we're going to be talking about scales throughout the conversation, state scale, national scale, global scale. But if we just zoom in on local scales, and I think environmental justice is usually challenged and addressed at local scales. If we look at the California context, about 40% of California's water comes from groundwater. And that groundwater consumed, especially in places like the Central Valley, where a lot of the food in California is grown, we're seeing those depletions of the groundwater going to agricultural uses, making it so that people don't have access to drinking water or quality drinking water, especially for agricultural communities. And those are continuing to exacerbate, especially when we're thinking about sustainably managing our water in the state. When we're thinking about who's growing our food and which communities are most impacted by growing our food. We know that those communities are often disadvantaged communities. And when you're depleting their water for just personal consumption and family consumption, it makes it really challenging and makes this issue of environmental justice more exacerbated and more magnified, particularly in areas such as Central Valley of California. When we think about more sort of national scales and how we're using water across the country and how that relates to environmental justice, I think one of the key pieces with the Objective 5 for sustainably managing lands and waters to enhance resilience as part of this framework, one of the things that the federal government is really looking at is how do we start to incorporate nature-based solutions, things that have multiple uses, to really enhance the resilience of communities, and who's benefiting from these investments in nature-based solutions. And so one of the things that I study is looking at, how do we implement nature-based solutions, particularly in disadvantaged communities, so that we're addressing the three main things. One is water scarcity. So in times of drought, how do you have more water for people and communities? The second thing is quality of water. We know that nature-based solutions do improve water quality. And then the last piece of it is flood mitigation. We know that the more impervious land that we have, the more opportunities there's for people to lose property and economic value from floods. And so this is where we think that nature-based solutions can have a huge impact, and something that we're studying right now.
Arthur, and I know that nature-based solutions are a priority for you for a long period of time. And how do you see the role of nature-based solutions to climate change fitting into this landscape of improving food security, and especially food security for the most vulnerable?
Well, thank you very much. I think that, as Khalid was just saying, that we know that the essence of agriculture is nature. And so focusing on how we not only use our soils to support the agricultural production that we need, but to protect those soils and the water and how we use it to ensure that we increase productivity, but also increase the health of the soils for the longer term is quite critical to ensuring that we bring regenerative agriculture to life. And then on the other end of that spectrum, it's much like what we do with the work that we're performing in Rwanda today, where we're looking to scale up the production of poultry. And we know that scaling up the production of poultry in Rwanda is difficult because of the cost of feed. And 70% of the cost of production is feed, because soy is so expensive. So we're using black soldier fly larvae to substitute for soy in the production of the feed for poultry, which will give us the ability to build circularity into the food system by using organic food waste as the feedstock for the flies instead of putting it into a landfill, using the flies then as nature's, which is what chickens and fish often eat, as the larvae, and producing that larvae that then supports the ability for us to make not only reducing the food waste, bringing in a nature-based solution, but also increasing the affordability of eggs and poultry for a population where 25% of the children are chronically stunted today. So these are the kinds of solutions that are necessary to support not just making the change, but making the structural change across the system that support the outcomes that we want to achieve.
Arthur, can you comment on how much the kinds of solutions that you've uncovered are kind of one-off opportunities versus general things that could be duplicated everywhere?
When you consider, too often what we do is we research a lot. We start lots of projects, but we don't scale. Because only 4% of the climate finance capital today goes into the food system, which would allow for the scale that is necessary to support us avoiding those one-off solutions and beginning to see the type of scaling of solutions to create the systemic change that is necessary to truly achieve the transformation of the food system. But the reality of it is, and the data suggested, that this is about a $250 billion a year investment that is required annually in order for us to actually scale. We're nowhere near that level of investment to make the type of improvements that are required.
Yeah, actually, that leads me to ask Dylan about the kind of recognition that the food system is a really gigantic part of the global economy. It's a gigantic part of the U.S. economy and the economy of almost every state. Are we underinvesting consistently in providing sustainable food, and how should legislators think about that?
Yeah, really good question, and really appreciate this dialogue. I guess two things I want to touch on. One is who's doing the farming, and the second is that piece you're saying right here about how are we building that into systems for the sustainability piece. In terms of who's doing it, there's been a big push recently to really think about beginning farmers, farmers from socially disadvantaged, which is a term I've seen in a lot of policies. And so that's where I'm pulling that from. I know there's obviously preferred terms, but from socially disadvantaged backgrounds, thinking about BIPOC farmers and all these different demographics. Some of the USDA data I've seen is that the average age of a farmer is about 59. And so I think there's an increasing recognition that we need a new generation coming in. And we're seeing data to back it up that the newer generation coming in tends to be more sustainable, more open to regenerative agricultural practices, cover crops, rotational grazing, all these different things that really are backed up time and time again. And so what we're starting to see at the state level is more and more states, really across the board, bipartisan approaches that are providing tax credits, incentives, loan repayments, and things like that, really focused on that newer generation of farmers. And so I think that's really important. And that kind of trend continuing, it's happening in Minnesota and Wisconsin, California, New York, across coast, Midwest. That's really important because that's that next generation that's coming in. And I think they're coming into a world that's a little different in terms of that you have some large scale farms, but I've also toured farms in the Midwest that have maybe their farm and they also have a food stand and they go to the farmers market on the weekends. And we're seeing more of that happening. I think that's becoming part of what some folks are seeking out. I think the other piece to that, so that's the who's doing this. And I think that's really important because it has some really important environmental justice tie-ins of how we make sure this is an accessible practice for everyone. It costs a lot of money to get into farming. And so making sure that's supported. The second piece is how we build that in. So when we look at state funds that go out, really trying to make sure there's requirements around things like cover crops or sustainable practices and trying to build that in both at the state level, but also work at the Farm Bill federally and some of our other really big farming investments. I think we're also looking more into how climate funds can go into nature-based solutions. So thinking a little bit about this intersection of all of these, as we think about flooding in the Mississippi River region, for example. How do we try and build in more sustainable floodplains that means that we're not having crops and fields constantly flooded, or that we're not just trying to build a bigger flood wall here that then pushes it into the neighbor's field. And so I think those nature-based solutions are directly tied to the food systems that we're all trying to really protect and we want to see thrive. And so places like Washington with their Historic Climate Commitment Act a couple of years ago, they are starting to invest with that money into nature-based solutions. In Maryland, they have a Resilience Authorities bill that is really helping localities get access to bonding to fund climate resilience projects. And part of that is around green space and stormwater protection. And so starting to get into these conversations. And then I think the final piece I just think is worth mentioning is more and more conversations around indigenous food systems, particularly conversations around how that could play into the Farm Bill, what kind of language is needed to open up opportunities there, thinking about how that plays a role in state economies. Minnesota, the wild rice is a very big there's a lot of folks really focused on wild rice in Minnesota. So I feel like I've heard a lot of those conversations of how can that be tied in a little bit more into the conversations we're having around sustainable food systems. And I think then that also loops back around to this environmental justice conversation of who's really participating in this and how do we make sure that's supported.
Khalid, both Earthram and Dylan have spoken to the need to transition to a more regenerative approach to agriculture. And you've spoken to some of the issues with water as a foundation for that. Are there particular things that people should think about how to make this transition successful in a way that's compatible with water supplies that differ so dramatically around the country and depending on the time of year?
Yeah, and I think a lot of states are thinking about this right now as we move towards more water reuse and thinking about diversifying the water portfolio. I think that's going to be a key piece going forward is really thinking about how are you diversifying your water portfolio. You can't only rely on one source of water, whether that's, you have a reservoir, or that you have a groundwater system, or that you have water that you're getting from runoff or precipitation. As climate change is going to be exacerbating weather conditions across the country in different ways. On the west, you've got droughts for prolonged periods. On the east, you've got rainfall that can create, large flooding issues, or that water is not being collected or harvested in the right way. Thinking critically about how do you manage whatever water condition you have in your specific locality is going to be extremely important as we start to move towards some of these things. One thing I did want to sort of build off of in terms of what Ethan and Dylan were saying across with respect to this issue of environmental justice is when we're thinking about these new systems that are coming online, new technology that comes online, new infrastructure systems, or thinking critically about how we're going to be sourcing, whether it's food, water, energy, or air. Environmental justice is not just thinking about who's been impacted by the burden of environmental injustice, but also thinking about who's benefiting from investments in the environment or environmental technology, or moving forward and thinking about looking ahead and into the future as we start to bring along things like nature-based solutions, who's benefiting from them. And I think one thing that was really laid out very well in the in Objective 5 was this idea of increasing opportunities for public-private partnerships in terms of for advancing conservation for climate resilience. I think a part of that, I love public-private partnerships. I think that they are effective, but I also think there needs to be another layer added to that, which is how are we incorporating communities? What is the distributional and procedural justice that's being incorporated as part of that transition, right? How are we incorporating ground scale local communities into decision-making processes, into, lifting them up as we go into the future? I think that's going to be extremely important. And I think Ethan and Dylan both touched on this a little bit. I just wanted to make sure I was highlighting that as part of a key component of environmental justice. Sometimes we focus so much on, who's been burdened without thinking about who's benefiting.
When you think about this diverse portfolio of water sources and water acquisition strategies, what do we have to do to make sure that the diverse portfolio doesn't end up favoring the big actors who have the financial resources to tap into the new reservoir or to lift deep groundwater?
Yeah, I've always been a proponent of more federal intervention in water systems. It's not something that I think it's something that water systems across the U.S. are really hoping to start to get back to. If we think back to the investments made during the Clean Water Act and the Safe Drinking Water Act, we know that those investments are heavily from the federal governments in the form of grants to states to build out their water infrastructure systems. Since then, we've seen a 70% decrease in federal investment in water systems. And I think that decrease, or, we can call it a disinvestment, or we can call it a decrease in investment, has actually led to these sort of inequities that we see in our water systems today. Systems that didn't benefit from those investments early on are now having to sort of, are now dealing with the sort of fallout from those disinvestments. And as we know, nothing lasts forever. Pipes rust, water sources need to be diversified, et cetera. And so I'm a huge proponent for more federal intervention into water systems. And I think that would create a way for more equitable distribution of resources when you have larger federal support.
Very well said. Now, one topic I want to make sure we have a chance to talk about is the kind of heavy burden of meat production, especially beef, on providing a sustainable food system around the world. Earthrin, you already spoke about ways to raise poultry with novel kinds of feed sources, but the big impact of animal agriculture is through beef. Are there ways that we can do beef sustainably, or do we need to pursue the kind of strategy that you've already talked about with poultry?
I think it's what we call a diversity of solutions that are required. That the suggestion that there's a silver bullet out there, if all North Americans and Europeans stopped eating beef and we reduce the herd size across the globe, but then you have the unintended consequences of the impact on communities, that depend upon livestock production, of households that depend upon it. But there's a different way forward. Yes, in some parts of the world, including the United States, we need to reduce the consumption of beef, but we also need sustainable livestock management, which means that we need to produce differently to reduce the amount of emissions from the livestock production methodologies that we use today. There are also new biological feeds coming online that support and reduce, if not eliminate, belching. We talk about the new red seaweed and the effect that has on the production of cattle. But there are other CRISPR-based solutions that are under research and development as we speak here today. And there's one at UC Davis, in fact, that would eliminate belching by cattle. And so we know that science is part of the answer here to help us ensure that we are addressing the challenges of beef. And the reason when I talk about reduction of consumption, I focus on the US and Europe, because there are other parts of the world, particularly sub-Saharan Africa, Latin America, where animal protein is needed to support chronic malnutrition because of lack of access to different varieties of protein. But even in those places, how we produce in the future should be driven by science to support the economic opportunity that livestock means for many of these communities, as well as the food security and malnutrition that animal protein provides for the consumers in those areas. So again, it's a diversity of solutions that we need all of the above to ensure that we are bringing the tools online that bring down the greenhouse gas emissions of livestock, but also affecting the human health in a positive way. And the last thing I think is really critical here is that the solutions that come online must come online not just for affluent farmers or affluent consumers. We need to ensure the justice element that we've talked about throughout this entire conversation that Khalid keeps bringing us back to, that it is so imperative that we ensure that small farmers and Black and women-owned farmers have access to those tools in managing livestock, as well as when new feeds come online and new foods come online, that they are available to the consumers, that regardless of income.
And are you optimistic that we can achieve the goals of sustainable animal agriculture and continue to provide sufficient food for the world's growing population? Or does something have to give in that system somewhere?
The investments need to happen, and I've had the privilege of having conversations with all of the large livestock producers here in the United States, as well as working with different governments across the global South, who are committed to continuing to produce livestock, but recognize they must perform differently, and that is going to require the investments that have been described by all of the speakers here today, as well as the scale up of the learnings from those investments to ensure that we are performing differently. And the biggest challenge that we have is that we're not bringing consumers along with us. We need consumers who are demanding better production. Because as one farmer in Iowa told me, I will grow it the way that the consumer in the market will buy it. And today, we know that many consumers can't afford to pay more, and many consumers won't pay more, those who can afford, for more sustainably produced livestock. That must change. And that is the consumer awareness and education that we need to, communities like Stanford need to ensure that we're not just talking to each other, that we're talking to the communities of interest, the communities of consumers where we have reach.
Dylan Earthron speaks of the role of education and consumer demand in changing animal agriculture. Animal agriculture also heavily subsidized in this country. And I wonder if there are things happening that might realign the financial incentives to facilitate some of the things that Earthron's talking about.
It's a really good question. I sometimes say that one of the benefits of this job is that getting to see 50 states doing 50 different things at all times gives me a lot of hope, because I'm able to see some of that research and some of those little tiny steps forward, whether it's a new tax credit or a new piece of science and way of approaching something, or a small scale project that can be scaled up to the state level after it's at the local level. And so I think a lot of that is coming. And then on top of that, you see the private sector investment in some of the meat alternatives. I know even folks like Bill Gates on a very large scale have been investing in some of these. And so we're seeing a lot of that come out now. I think one thing that, obviously we're a nonpartisan organization, but there are certain states where you see places like Nebraska where beef is, I think it is the beef state. And they had a beef passport program that's been in effect for a few years now. And that was in response to some of these policies or proposals that were coming out, really focused on possibly cutting back on beef consumption. I think those are really important to keep in mind, because some of this really, depending on how some states move faster than others, trying to think about, I think what Earthron's saying here is that, are there ways of approaching this so you can help folks that are really focused on beef in Nebraska versus maybe folks in Stanford that are maybe a little bit more willing to buy some of the alternative meat products right off the bat. And you start to get into that kind of early adopter curve of the bell curve, the famous one of, who do you bring along with you with some of these new technologies? I think another piece that's always really important on the government side is thinking about label programs and how you promote those. I think there's rightfully so a lot of confusion sometimes on consumers of what does the organic label mean? What does free range mean for, that's more, and thinking about some of the poultry labels and making sure that there's solid education and outreach to go along with some of these programs and investments to make sure folks know that if they're paying more, that there's actually a benefit attached to that and understanding what it is. I think there have been some maybe higher profile cases where folks find out later that, some of these labels don't mean what they thought that meant. And so then that can be discouraging if you're a consumer that was potentially paying more or trying to do the right thing. And so I think it's really important to pair that with, we know where there's a lot of research, investment, opportunity coming that can help. And then we also want to make sure that where we are investing, we're putting in that outreach component to help folks understand why things are happening and where they can potentially help invest in the future of sustainable practices.
And can you comment on, in the context of this idea of kind of a diversified production space and diversified consumption, does it feel like the pathway to sustainability is compatible with that? That if Nebraska wants to continue to emphasize meat production, or California wants to continue to be a large dairy producer, that we can fit that into a sustainability agenda?
That's a really big $1 million question. I would say that I think that's where I don't have a solid answer, but I think that's a question that a lot of people are wrestling with right now. And I think it's one where, everyone wants to be able to continue. I think we see this question with a lot of climate change topics right now. Everyone wants to be able to use the same amount of water and not have anything change, the same amount of electricity, all these, to eat the same foods and not have to worry about it. And I think that we're trying to wrestle with all of that, both from a government perspective and an individual perspective of what changes are feasible, what changes are possible, and what is just something that's not compatible, like you're saying, with a future world that's actually going to be sustainable, growing population, increasing temperatures, increasing strain on our food systems as they exist today. And so I don't have a solid answer, but I do think it's something that's on the minds of a lot of legislators. I want to actually just pivot back to water for a second, because I think that a similar topic in conversation is happening. And Khalid did a really good job of touching on some of these water security concerns for the future. So in Oregon is where I live. And we are obviously facing a lot of climate impacts in recent years, both from drought, but also with different rainfall patterns, from warmer temperatures, not having as much snowpack in some years. And so what that means is the state is really trying to plan further out for water and drought security. This last year, the legislature created, in the last year, they created a water caucus. It's a bipartisan water caucus, which is really exciting. And they put together a drought and security package of several bills. Really, what they did essentially that I think is really novel is they kind of dreamed big. They said, this is the dream. This is how much money we need, millions of dollars to be able to do everything we need in terms of addressing water rights, in terms of better planning, the technology we need, the integration, the education, all those different pieces. I think there was around 11 different pieces of that were able to move forward so far, and it's something they're going to keep working on. But I think what's important about that is kind of stepping back and saying that if we were to actually do this right, as we understand it right now, here's the price tag. It's big, it's not pretty, it scares off a lot of folks, but if you have that milestone or you have that flag in the sand, so to speak, I think that there's similar ways of approaching other climate topics to say, this is how we understand it. And then you can open up conversations around, how do you collaborate? How do you have public-private partnerships, education, research to help address some of those? But it really helps kind of have a government-led approach to say, if we were to do some of these, this is what it would take, and we need to figure out how we start planning for that money in the future.
Yeah, excellent. We're going to switch to audience questions in just a few more minutes. And as a reminder, if you have a question, please type it into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. I have one more question for Khalid, following up on this issue of water. We do know that animal agriculture, and especially commercial animal feeding operations, are a big source of water pollution around the country. And can you describe whether or not that's a problem, that we have technology solutions to get under control, or is it something that we kind of have to live with?
No, absolutely. That's a great question, Chris. I was actually hoping we would circle back to that when I heard Ethan talk about, in Nebraska, or sorry, in Iowa, a farmer is willing to sell the beef for what people are willing to pay for it, or whatever animal it may be. Whatever people are willing to pay for that meat is what they'll provide. The concentrated animal feeding operations are, I think they're called CAFOs. North Carolina is a good example of that, where those operations are producing a lot of waste that are going into nearby water streams that are affecting communities that are drinking, polluted water from CAFOs pollution. The technology does exist to help those CAFOs farmers be more sustainable and reduce the effluent that leaves their systems from being so toxic to nearby communities. The challenge is the implementation of that technology means that they would have to increase their meat prices. Mm-hmm. And as soon as they increase their meat prices, they're no longer competitive. And then that, follows this sort of chain of they're out of business all of a sudden. And so getting back to your question of, does the technology exist? Yes. Is it feasible to implement the technology? Depends on the size of the operation, and then also what people are willing to pay. I think it also comes back to something Dylan has said is, if we could label it as, hey, this is meat that was produced in a facility that uses anaerobic digesters to prevent, prevent waste from getting into nearby water, then, maybe people would be willing to pick it up and say, hey, I'll pay an extra $1 for it, or an extra 50 cents per pound, or whatever it may be. But right now that's just not happening. And a lot of the farmers are concerned that, they may just be priced out of the market if they were to implement technologies that would reduce their waste discharge in nearby communities.
Earthrin, what about this question of the technological solutions making the products, whether it's meat or vegetables or poultry, more expensive, especially when we think about it in the international context, where food security is so a critical issue for 1 billion of the world's poorest people? Do we need to somehow have these investments that are critical be supported at the government level, or are there market mechanisms that we can be using?
There's a combination of those that are required. We know that there are $700 billion a year in agricultural subsidies that are distributed globally. We also know that 85 here in the United States, 85% of our agricultural subsidies go to 15% of the farmers, and to subsidize the traditional row crops. But that's beginning to change. We're seeing a change in the Climate Smart Agriculture Act, with the Sustains Act, with the IRA, that there are new subsidies that are coming online to support farmers in this transition from what they're doing today to what the practices that are required to support the more sustainable production in the future, whether we're talking about row crops or specialty crops or livestock. Much of the subsidies that are coming online for livestock, for local and regional processing of livestock as well, which brings the livestock back onto farms and back into more regional production and feeding lots, as opposed to the CAFOs that we saw during COVID, that created those very long value chains that resulted in much of the challenge that was illuminated during the COVID crisis, and that the government has attempted to begin to address by investing in more local and regional processing and management of livestock. That is a significant part of the equation that must come online. And in order to avoid the increase in prices that will occur if the farmers do not have the financial support that is necessary, they're going to pass along the cost of the change into the market, and that is ultimately going to affect affordability and availability of food in a system where 45 million Americans today are food insecure, and 3.1 billion people, as I said before, globally can't afford access to a diverse, nutritious diet. So we know that there's a significant role for government to play to support the type of the transition that is necessary for farmers, whether it's new seeds or new production methodologies for livestock management.
Terrific. Thank you guys so much for a fabulous set of comments. I would like to turn now to questions from the audience. And let me start with this one. Are there any efforts out there related to engaging private landowners in resilience efforts? And what would panelists suggest to best engage this group? Dylan, you want to start with that one?
Yeah, I think that's a really big conversation right now. And I would say one of the biggest places that's happening is what's called the America the Beautiful effort. If folks are familiar, really started as 30 by 30 conservation, preserving 30% of land and waters by 2030, renamed and kind of slightly recategorized federally as America the Beautiful. One of the questions with America the Beautiful really comes down to what counts. And so there's an atlas that has just come out and really thinking about, is it only public lands? But really, if we're going to reach 30%, we really need to include private landowners. And so I mean, the part of this is happening right now as we think about states. Some states have, 90+% of privately owned land across their state. And so I think one piece is thinking about incentives. How do we figure out conservation incentives, easements? That's a big piece. I think there's a big part of it of figuring out when state funds are coming out, how do you have requirements around sustainable conservation practices as part of receiving those state or federal funding? That's been a really important piece because a lot of folks are accessing the money. And then I think another piece really goes back to what we were talking about earlier of trying to think about who's coming into this field now and making that part of the training that goes into that. And so as you have newer farmers coming in, but really trying to recognize that, I think more and more states are trying to lift that up as part of their promotional aspect materials in terms of governors talking about what's happening with water conservation and land conservation. And so people are wanting to tell those stories. And I think that some of the grain producers in the Mississippi River region, for example, are investing in some of these sustainability practices because it becomes an advertising opportunity for them, honestly, a marketing opportunity, which there you can say different things about it, but if it's incentivizing the right behavior, to the point about that Earthrin made of people will grow what consumers will buy, I think part of that also starts with the consumer and trying to really elevate that folks want to see better land practices, and then that comes in through government incentives and hopefully through private actors making that change.
Earthrin, can you comment on how some of these incentives play out internationally? Are things like fair trade labeling providing a real nudge?
Yes and no. We're when you get into the global trading system and agriculture, that's a tough area, as you know. And what you see a hodgepodge at the national level of regulations in place. The FAO has put forward suggested guidance for national governments in support of different changes in activity. But the biggest problem that we see, and it's a conversation that you hear now in the global climate community with agriculture, is the investment that is necessary. Most of the countries that need to make those investments don't have the capital to make the changes that are necessary. Whether it is because it is not just and it's not just approval of policies, it's implementation of policies, and that has a cost. And with the number of governments in the global South that are particularly dealing with financial issues today, particularly in the post-COVID, post-Ukraine world, that the demand for the adaptation money that the global North promised to the global South to support the changes that are necessary, which has not come online, is limiting what is actually being scaled up in most of the global South.
Let me turn to a question for Khalid. This one's from Michael Connor. Most water agency fees are quite regressive, so tightening environmental regs hits disproportionately to the poor and average ratepayer. Are there examples to solve this or new ideas for solving this?
Yeah, I mean, I wish I had an answer to that one. I come back a little bit to what I said before about there needing to be more federal investment in water systems, because the participant who asked the question is absolutely correct. Anytime that there is a change or investment that's needed in a water system, a lot of that burden falls directly on the end user or the ratepayer. And it is quite regressive. I've seen some models where they've tried to integrate water infrastructure investments into property taxes, but they haven't been very successful. I've seen different affordability models where you've got customer assistance programs or different affordability rates based on things that don't have to do with how much water you use on a daily basis. But I haven't seen anything that has gained significant traction currently. But I do know that there's extensive research happening on this, particularly at Stanford. I know Dr. Sarah Fletcher's lab is looking holistically at water affordability and what that looks like for communities, and if there are different metrics and models that can be used to address what you said, a regressive model that currently exists. But I don't know of anything currently in production.
A hard problem. Here's a question from Qiyuan Guo. How do you think agroforestry practices can contribute to climate mitigation and food security? Earthrin, agroforestry.
It's an obvious solution in places where we want to protect forests, but we also need to address the issues of food security. The challenge again is back to the affordability of the seeds and tools that are necessary to support the scale up of successful agroforestry projects into real marketplace opportunities for the farmers. And so we know that it's coming online, but is it coming online fast enough? No. But it is there's a proven technology, it's a proven agricultural harvesting practice that in many places could offer the environmental solution as well as the economic solutions that communities need.
Including places in the US, as I understand.
Including places in the US, particularly in California.
Terrific. Question, probably this one's for Dylan. Can you specifically speak to some of the bipartisan infrastructure law investments you've seen communities most effectively adopt or implement to create resilient water systems or increase working land resilience?
It's a really good question. I was trying to just do some quick, trying to pull up some things right now as Earthworm was talking. I think a lot of it is still in progress, and I think part of that is kind of going into the state legislative timelines and cycles. So the Oregon bill I mentioned, the big water drought and security package, that really was based on trying to leverage some of those federal funds. A lot of those from the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. In many cases, those have really kind of sometimes strict match requirements that can be tough for states to meet. And so making sure that those are built in is really important and that you're creating funding for that so you can bring it in. It addresses everything from aquifer recharge to groundwater issues to safe drinking water. And so I think that's a big piece. There's another piece that I think is really interesting that doesn't always get as much attention is I was trying to find the exact number, but millions of dollars for habitat connectivity in the bipartisan infrastructure law. And I think what's important there is kind of going back to my initial point of if you're a lawmaker, how can you combine topics of shared interest? And I think habitat connectivity conversations really start to get into that. If you're creating viable habitat for wildlife, especially beyond just crossings on highways, but thinking about large scale migrations and so forth, you can then use that funding to really think about ecosystem protection, habitat at large, which then starts to get into conversations around floodplains and so forth. And so we've seen a lot of states really pushing forward with habitat connectivity, very bipartisan all across the country, putting real dollars down to invest in that. And I think in states like Pennsylvania, there's conversations connecting that to outdoor recreation and engagement, thinking about trail systems. You have conversations tying that into, I think, just this larger ecosystem conversation about biodiversity loss. But then you also have these conversations around just highway development. And so it's one of those topics where on the surface, maybe doesn't tie directly into the water system when I just say it like that. But I think if it's one of those that has probably been one of the fastest to mobilize in some of these ways. And I think we'll start to see more and more of those carry out. Some states have, a lot of states have really short sessions this year on even years. And there's states, I think 5 or so that don't even meet. And so I think some of these will continue to play out in the next year or two as states continue to activate some of those federal dollars.
Mm-hmm.
Been a fabulous conversation. We're just about out of time. We have enough time for a quick closing comment from each of you or a response to the question that I should have asked but didn't. Earthworm, you want to start?
About half of all U.S. farmland will change hands in the next decade. The next 15 years. And the younger farmers that are coming online, the women farmers that are coming online, so many are interested in regenerative agriculture, supporting not only production, but reduction of emissions, using agriculture to support our environmental needs as well as our food and health needs. It is an imperative that the programs that Dylan was talking about that were come down from the federal governments and distributed across to the states, change the economics on our farm to support the farmer's ability to produce differently. This is work that the U.S. Department of Agriculture is working to try and proselytize around what is necessary at the state level, because you can have the legislation passed at the federal level, but unless state governments are providing the support that is necessary and the distribution of those resources that can change behavior for those farmers, we're not going to see the type of production that is necessary for us to equitably and sustainably change our food system for our environment and human health. And we can't keep doing what we've always done. We must move forward differently.
Yeah, thank you, Dylan. Closing thought.
Wonderful segue. I think just to underscore a million times that there's so much happening at the state level, and my call to action for everyone is to pay attention to that, because no matter what happens in November, thinking about federal policies, it is really going to be down to the states in the next 4 years. All the federal programs that went into effect with BIL, thinking about IRA, those are now going to become state implementation, going down to the local level. The states are passing thousands of bills every year versus Congress, which is maybe not moving quite as fast. And so I would really encourage folks to be looking at the state level, thinking about integration. How do topics like wildlife habitat connectivity connect with water, with climate funding, with urban heat, all these different topics coming together? State legislators, as I mentioned at the start, they're under-resourced, but they're really eager for help. They're eager for good ideas and eager to connect with everyone on this call.
Thank you. Khalid.
I think everything that I would have liked to have said has already been said very beautifully. I would just add one small piece that I think connects all of this together, which is building out technical capacity for people who are trying to access things like BIL, IRA, all the investments that have been made in the last 4 years or 3.5 years. Would love to see technical capacity be built out so that people know how to access those funds, whether it's grant writing workshops or assigning people to help certain communities figure out how to really access and appreciate those resources.
Yeah, super important. What a wonderful discussion. Let me close with a final thank you to Earthworm Cousin, Dylan McDowell, Khalid Osman. Thanks to all of you in the audience for joining us today. And I also want to do a final thank you to the superb Woods Institute staff. That includes Lee Rosenbaum, Kamaya Daniels, Molly Field, Roberta Tugendreich, Celia Price, and Christine Black. Thanks to Justin Warren, Evan Schwartz for the Zoom support. Farewell, everyone.